Hey guys, Michael here. As you can see, I have my conveyor set up on my P2. Today, I'm going to show you how to use it and share some tips and tricks along the way to get the most of your material and to make sure your engraving or your cut is straight on your material. Stick around, let's get to it. The maximum size you can cut on the conveyor is 19.6 inches wide and up to 118 inches long. Now, depending on your material, you need to check the xTool website because different materials have different lengths you can actually use on the conveyor. If you want to go to the maximum length, you'll have to add some additional rails, and you can find that on the xTool website. Today, I'm going to cut a 3-foot board. It's 3 foot by 10 inches. Inside XES, you can see this is the design I'm going to go with. This line represents the outside edge of the material, and the inside lines is what I'm going to be engraving and scoring. This line over here on the left, I'm going to explain what that's for here in a minute. One thing to note, when you set up your conveyor, make sure everything's level to the P2 itself. What I do is I use a little level and I level to see where the bubble is on top of the P2. It doesn't necessarily have to be level, but you want to make a note of where the bubble is. Then take your level, put it on top of the rails and check to make sure the bubble is in the same space as it is on top of the P2. Check that on the front and the back. Now, when it comes to the rails, you have to pay attention to make sure you have one, enough length of rails for your material, and two, make sure you put the right rail inside the P2. As you can see here, these rails have an indicator on the rail itself. These are the original rails that xTool came out with. If you have newer rails, they're actually going to be hollow. You want to make sure you use the right rail connected to this. You want to use the hollow one or the ones marked with the little laser. The reason is the laser is actually going to travel right on top of the rail. If you use the wrong rail, the wrong spot, you'll actually cut your rail, and you don't want to do that. Another thing to point out is your cable that connects the conveyor to your P2, make sure it's secure and out of the way. When setting up your rails, you want to make sure the width is set up to match your material so that it supports it all the way across. Also, you want to make sure that you line up the front rail and the back rail so that material can be supported as it pulled through the conveyor. Another thing to note is make sure your material is wide enough to span across at least 3 rails if possible. You definitely want to make sure your material is underneath the pressure indicator roller, which is the one in the middle. This will allow you to adjust it based on the material settings and the xTool recommendation pressure settings. To set the pressure, insert your material underneath the rollers and using the knob on the right, lower it down and keeping an eye on the pressure gauge to make sure you have the right pressure to match your material. The knob on the bottom is used to feed the material in and out manually. So here's a tip for you to get the most of your material. The rollers are in the front of the conveyor. The laser is about 9 to 10 inches away from the rollers. The material must be in contact with the rollers at all times so that it can engrave on it properly and be able to move the material. So you waste about 9 to 10 inches of material at the bottom of your board. One way I found to get around that is attaching a piece of wood to the back side of my material. That way, as it feeds through, it uses that same piece of material that's attached to this and uses that to push the material the rest of the way through. Let's head to the table and I'll set that up. Here I have my 3-foot piece, and this is a small piece. It's about 10 inches long, and I cut it the same width as my 3-foot piece. Using some pieces of painter's tape, I can actually put this up against the material, tape this down, tape it down on both sides. I'm just going to wrap that tape around the bottoms, making sure to try to keep that material or that tape flat. Once you have that nice and secure, this is one solid piece now that will go through the conveyor so that you can use the most of your material. To make sure your material will feed straight, use the grid on the conveyor to line up your material. One thing that I do is line up the front, put my finger on it, and swing the back around until the back lines up with the grid as well. Once I have everything set up, I will lock it down using the knob on the right hand side and set the pressure so that it will not wiggle left and right anymore. Okay, I'm just about ready to do this. What I want to make sure is sort of do a framing test to make sure this material is lined up straight. Even though it's lined up with the grid visually, I want to double check that and feed this through using XCS and the conveyor. Doing this on a test will make sure your material is straight and your engraving won't come out crooked or your cut on your material. We are connected to the P2. I'm going to change from slat flat to conveyor feeder. As you can see, let me zoom out, and we have a really long working area. That is the full length working area of the conveyor. Everything below this line right here will be engraved or cut or processed. You want to make sure all of your project is below that line and within this grid from left and right. I'm going to move my project here in the middle. And before I do anything else, I'm going to measure the distance down to my material. To make sure I can see the material, I'm going to refresh the screen. Zooming in, as you can see, I can see the material. Let me measure the distance. Using the aimed measure, I'm going to click that, and on top of the material, I'm going to capture that distance. Now that the distance has been set, I'm going to capture a close view of that material. Zooming in, now I know where the top of the material is. The material is a little bit farther than I want it to be, so using the knob, I'm going to back it up and refresh the P2. What I'm going to do now is process this line. I'm not concerned about actually making a mark on the material, so I have it moved away from the material. What I'm more concerned about is this material being pulled through the conveyor straight? If it is not, I'll notice that and be able to make adjustments as needed. So I'm going to hit process, send this to the conveyor. I'm going to hit start on the P2 and keep an eye on this material and how it lines up with the grid. Okay, so if you notice that the material actually moved a little bit to the right. And so what I'm going to do is loosen this just a little bit, hold this in, and I'm going to swing the backside a little bit to the left. That way my engraving will actually look straight on this board. Back in XCS, I'm happy with the way that went, so I'm going to now set up my project. I'm going to take this line that I use as a way to frame, and I'm going to set it to ignore. I'm going to move it out of the way using my arrow keys. Then I'm going to take my project and put it on top of the material. Zooming in, I can use the edge of this line here that is the same size as my material to help line up the engraving to the board. Now let's go through the layers that I have here. I have my length check. That is the line we used originally. That is set to ignore. I have my outline, which is the outline of this material, just to help me center everything. That is also set to ignore. Now on the engrave, I am using 40% power, 250 millimeters per second. What I'm going to engrave is the word home and the outside border here. All of these items have been combined using the Unite feature so that it engraves all of this at one time all the way down. The last thing are the leaves. I'm going to be using 60% power and 80 millimeters per second on the scoring. And we are ready to go. Click on process, double check the preview, hit start, and press the button on the P2. One thing I noticed is that the engraving is very light. So what I'm going to do, without touching anything at all, I'm going to select everything, set it to ignore, select just the engraven portion, set it to output, change it from engrave to score. And I'm going to score this at 60% power, 70 millimeters per second, so that it can give it an outline and let it stand out a little bit more. Well, here she is. Here's my 3-foot high by 10-inch wide home sign. As you can see here, I can leave this the way it is. I can stain it. I can paint the letters and paint the monstera leaves. Really, it's up to you and your imagination. Now, again, this is capable of running up to 118 inches. This piece here, this 3 foot by 10-inch piece, this took about 2.5 hours. You do have to plan accordingly. Make sure you have plenty of time, especially if you're going to do an engraved piece. Make sure you set aside plenty of time because this does take a while to go across and build your piece. Even if you're cutting something, it does take a while as well. Now, as far as cutting goes, I've made a lot of cut pieces on the conveyor. I've cut out a few different signs, whether it be a wood, on acrylic. It's still the same process as far as lining up your material goes, making sure it's following the grid and goes in there straight. Now, the only difference between cutting and engraving and scoring is you have to add tabs to your project inside XCS. What the tabs are little gaps of, while it's cutting, it's going to stop and cut, stop and cut, and sort of make it perforated so that you can break out the piece later on. Those tabs keep the smaller pieces from dropping and jamming inside the conveyor and stopping it from feeding through. So you want to try and use a test piece to try that out. Make sure you have the right number of tabs and just kind of get a feel for how you want to set up before you tackle something as large as this or even bigger. So that's all I want to share with you. I appreciate you spending some time with me. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time.